Hello, everyone, and welcome to part one of our lecture on Chapter 7 Data Collection for Quantitative Research. So, in in Chapter 4, which was the first chapter that you read for this week, we really focused heavily on the different types of quantitative research designs that exist and getting some basics of components that are required for quantitative research, such as randomization and non-spuriousness, time components, all of that. So in chapter 7, we're going to go into a greater depth on the different types of data collection and what that data collection looks like for quantitative research specifically. So just as a very brief reminder, experimental designs are unique quantitative studies that include specific details. And those specific details include randomization, non-spuriousness, time components, so on and so forth. And a lot of times, experimental designs are attempting to investigate the possibility of how variables may affect each other in controlled settings. Quantitative studies collect information in the form of numbers to standardize information so that it can be processed through statistical tests. So, we have experimental research, which is conducting an experiment or intervention on one of the randomly assigned groups in a study while controlling finding with the other second group. So the experimental research comes out of these experimental designs, which are quantitative studies, and they're known for being quantitative because they are focused on collecting information in the form of numbers that standardizes the information across all of our participants and allows us to run statistical tests. There are some components of experimental research that are important to keep in mind. We've already talked about these, but I'll go into just a little bit on each of these as well. In experimental research, you have your experimental group and you have your control group. So the group that is being exposed to your experimental design and the one that is not. You also have you have your pretest and post-test to look for changes in your independent and dependent variable, changes in your dependent variable as based on your independent variable. You also have random assignment to allow your participants to be randomly assigned to the control and the experimental group. And you also have the protection from external explanations when you run an experimental group. So in experimental groups, or experimental designs, you are really trying to protect against any third unexplained variable that could influence your study. And you're doing that by following the standardized procedures. So let's talk a little bit more about data collection, because the data that's collected in experimental designs is the standardized information collected at the beginning and the end of a study. In classical experimental designs, both the control and the intervention group will take pre-tests and post-tests. And again, it is imperative that your pre-test is identical to your post-test. If there is a statistically significant difference between your pre-test and your post-test, then you can say that the null hypothesis can be rejected. You have enough evidence to say that the null hypothesis cannot be true in this experiment, so we can reject it and we can start to accept the alternative hypothesis. But this is when you're talking about a classical experimental design. And in psychology, a classical experimental design is not always feasible for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes we can't randomize our participants, they're naturally grouped, or maybe we have non-equivalent groups that are available. So a good example of this is I do a lot of research in suicide, and the groups that I'm looking at is oftentimes individuals who have attempted suicide and individuals who have not attempted suicide. And those groups are not equal. They're not equivalent to one another. They are oftentimes different in size as well as composition. So the identities of people in each of those groups can be vastly different and not equivalent to one another. So it's hard to run those groups as classic experiments, which is where we get the quasi-experimental design, which allows for us as researchers to conduct some form of an intervention and to measure the impact of that intervention without fulfilling the required conditions for a classical experimental study. Another type of data collection in quantitative studies that I want to go into a lot more detail on because it's so prominent in psychology is the survey. So keep in mind that when we're talking about a survey, this refers to a type of data collection, a method of data collection where you are asking participants to respond to specific sets of questions. When you hear the term survey, it refers to that data collection piece. If you hear the word questionnaire, that is referring to the instrument containing the questions. So, whatever that is in your study, if it's some measure of depression, some measure of anxiety, some measure of alcohol use, cannabis use, that is a questionnaire. The measure that contains the question is the questionnaire. And the method of collecting data by having participants respond to these questions is the survey method of data collection. Surveys within psychology can be both standardized and non-standardized. A non-standardized survey questionnaire is a questionnaire that was never tested for reliability and validity. It has a lot more variation in how it can be presented. There can be differences in how the questions have been presented to clients. Whatever it is, it has not been tested for its reliability and its validity with participants. A standardized survey questionnaire, on the other hand, is a questionnaire that has been tested and has been shown as both reliable and a valid form of data collection. So, if you are interested in doing a survey, if you're doing survey data collection with participants, there are multiple steps that you have to follow as a researcher. One of the first steps that you are going to have to fulfill as a researcher is to develop a list of constructs, all of the items and constructs that can be measured in a questionnaire that is related to your study. It's important for you to think about these list of constructs because it tells you what types of questions you need in your questionnaires. So based on your study, you ask yourself, what are all of the constructs that are of interest to me in this study? Once you've got that list of constructs, the next step is for you to figure out which ones of those constructs you want to measure, which ones you think are important from being measured or that can be observed. Once you've identified the constructs that can be measured, the next step for you is to evaluate how to best establish those constructs through the survey data collection process. So that means if you have a variable that can be measured, you want to look for related established survey questionnaires that can be used to measure that variable of interest. So if you have a study that is looking at cannabis use while participants are experiencing an episode of major depression, your constructs might be cannabis use as well as depression, and it can also include identity variables, age of the participants. It can involve a plethora of constructs. But the determined constructs that you want to measure end up being cannabis use and episodes of depression. So then in step 3, you might look at what established measures there are for determining someone's cannabis use as well as their experience with major depression in any given moment. And most often, you're going to be looking for various sources of questions and questionnaires. So wherever that is, you might be exploring current surveys, current questionnaires that are available. Some potential sources to find different questions are the US Census data. That can give you a pretty good indicator of what types of questions you need to ask to ascertain some information, such as professional organizations like the Department of Education or the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention. They have questionnaires that you can use to measure specific things depending on your area of interest. You can also look through previous research articles. What measures did they use? What did they use to measure the same thing that you're interested in measuring? And can you borrow that same open source questionnaire? So once you have your variables, you've identified your constructs, you've determined which ones can be measured, and you've found the way that you are going to measure them by making them into variables, the next step for you as a researcher is to convert or to turn those constructs into variables. And you do that as a researcher by consulting the literature to look for scientific possibilities and enumerate them on the questionnaire. So you create maybe a brief open-ended question about the topic that you're interested in. You might have just an open-ended yes or no question that says, are you experiencing an episode of major depression right now? Or you might look for the literature on how other people have measured cannabis use, and you're going to go from there. There are various ways that you can turn constructs into variables. And in the context of data collection and surveys, when you're turning it into a variable, that means that you're actually turning your construct into a question that your participants can answer. And there are various types of questions that your participants can answer. One of those is a closed variable, which has a predefined set of answers or multiple choice options that a participant can select from. So you might say a closed variable might be, are you experiencing an episode of major depression right now? And your answer options are yes or no. And there's no other options. That's a closed variable. Predetermined selected answer responses. As you can expect, closed variables tend to be more specific because as a researcher, you can distinguish between categories very easily. The answer is either yes or no. Maybe it's I identify as being assigned female at birth, or I assign being identified as male at birth, or I identify as being assigned intersex at birth. There are 3 categories and there are set specifics between each group, and it allows for that distinction between categories a lot easier. We also have what's called open variables. And open variables are where a participant supplies their own answer to the question in their own words. So it's an open question where it might say, describe your experience with major depression over the last 2 weeks. And then it's an open form question that the client gets to interpret in their own way. As you might expect, open variables are really great if you are looking for opinions and attitudes because it allows for that flexibility to hear the client where they're at, though they might not be great if you're looking for specificity because open-ended variables are not very specific. In fact, if you're a researcher and you're using open-ended variables, it oftentimes requires you to convert the data afterward. You have to interpret it in some way, and that varies depending on the variable that you're looking at. But if you're asking the question that I just posed of, tell me your experience with depression over the last 2 weeks, as a researcher, you might be tasked with coding that data or the responses to determine from that person's response, do they have a current episode of major depression? And you're having to interpret that based on the answers that the participants give. But again, if you're looking for more of the opinions and attitudes, especially on sensitive topics, it is helpful to have open-ended variables because it allows the participant to share what they're comfortable sharing. The next step in data collection via surveys is really just following some tips for creating possible questions, because turning a construct into a variable by turning it into a question can be complicated if you don't have a template to work off of. So there are a few different tips that you can follow to create the best possible list of questions. One of them is clarity. The wording of your questions is always better if it's clear and grammatically correct. If you have an accurate, clear question that there's little room for interpretation, your question is going to be interpreted better by your participants, and it's going to be interpreted more consistently across all of your participants. It's also important to have your questions be simple. Participants are donating their time to fill out a questionnaire for you, and they shouldn't need to struggle to understand what's being asked in the question. So it's always better to err on the side of being simple in your question organization. You also need to make sure that all of your questions are unbiased. You want to avoid guiding your participants to the answers that you're looking for. Have it be open-ended and unbiased. There's no connotation to the question so that you can get a real feel for what the client is experiencing. You also want your questions to be intelligible. So avoid the use of technical terms, because unless your population is a group that is specialized in this area of technical terms, your technical terms could confuse your clients. So it's better to stick with more colloquial language that is more widely known by the masses of people. You also want to avoid social desirability. So, social desirability is the tendency for participants to want to look good for the researcher. And in order to do that, they will avoid the truth. And in research, you want to make sure that you are asking questions in ways that will limit social desirability. So, if you're doing a study that is investigating how reading to your children influences their intelligence as adolescents, instead of asking questions to parents of, are you able to read to your child for 2 hours every night, you might just say, when you get time, how much time are you able to dedicate to reading? It eliminates some of the negative connotation with, oh, well, I want to read to my child a lot more, but you're telling me that I should be, so I should probably answer more than what I actually am. You also want to avoid double-barreled questions. So double-barreled questions are questions with two statements in the same question. So an example might be if you are looking at how well someone has adapted to a therapeutic setting, you might ask them the question, I have felt supported by the administration and my therapist at my clinical site. That's a double-barreled question because the responses to the question may be different depending on the categories that the person is answering. So maybe the person feels supported by their clinician, but they don't feel supported by the administrative staff. And because that question is combined, the participant might be in a place where they don't know how to respond because you're asking them to respond to both groups. So as a researcher who is constructing variables, you want to avoid these double-barreled questions. Make sure that all of your questions are only asking about one topic so that your participants can respond to just that one topic. And you also want to avoid double negatives. So avoiding questions that can be confusing because you are sort of negating some of the information. So saying something like, I disagree that the principal should not ring the bell before 8 a.m. Well, what does that mean? If you're saying I disagree and I don't want them to do it, does that mean that I agree with them ringing the bell before 8 a.m.? Like, avoiding those double negatives in a question can make it so that the participant can actually understand what you're saying. It's also important to keep in mind that there's such things as contingency questions when you are building a questionnaire in a survey. So contingency questions are what I like to call logic questions. And these are questions that will basically open and close additional follow-up questions depending on how a participant responds. So if you are wanting to investigate someone's cannabis use, you might ask a contingency question that says, have you used cannabis in the last 30 days? And if a participant answers yes, it will open a new set of follow-up questions about their cannabis use. How frequently, the potency, their route of administration, how they're accessing their cannabis, all of that. But if someone answers, no, I have not used cannabis in the last 30 days, that participant will be routed to the next set of questions because they don't need to answer the questions about their cannabis use if they haven't used in the last 30 days. Those are contingency questions. And contingency questions are particularly helpful in survey data collection because it eliminates the burden on your participants in answering questions that are not relevant to them. And also, you want to make sure that you are avoiding dangling alternatives. And dangling alternatives are when alternatives are put in a question before introducing the topic. So saying things like, do you disagree or agree with, or on a scale of 1 to 10, with this being most like you and most unlike you, do you like pineapple on pizza? It's providing the alternatives at the beginning of the question instead of at the end, and it can confuse the client so that they don't actually know what you're asking them about. So in a survey data collection, you want to make sure that you're putting those alternatives at the end. And finally, you want to make sure that you're avoiding hypothetical questions. Hypothetical questions can be difficult to capture and they may be understood differently by different participants. So it's always best to avoid them in survey form just because they're inconsistent in how well they measure the construct of interest that you are investigating. So we've gotten through step 5 of using survey data collection methods. Join me for part 2 of our lecture where we're going to continue these steps in survey collection in surveys or data collection in surveys, and we're going to talk a little bit more about different forms of data collection and quantitative research. I will see you all in the next lecture.